Hi, and welcome to the Fancy Comma YouTube. Today I'm joined by John C. Besley, PhD. John is Ellis N. Brandt Professor of Public Relations in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations at Michigan State University. He's the only one in his family without a biology degree. Instead of going the science route, Besley became a journalist and science policy analyst advising the Canadian government on environmental policy. He left his job in Ottawa to get a PhD in communication at Cornell University. At MSU, he studies public opinion about science and scientists' opinions about the public with the goal of helping science communicators be more strategic and effective. Welcome, Dr. Besley. You and Anthony Dudo are the authors of a book called Strategic Science Communication, which we've reviewed on the Fancy Comma blog. And it's a really good
Thank
book.
you.
It has kind of like tried and true strategies that can strategically make your science communication more effective. Scientists don't really get any formal training in communication beyond like write this paper or write your lab reports. Well, we did a little bit at MIT, and I talk about that on our blog and in our YouTube, but um, it's relatively rare. So tell us about what you do as a science communications person in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations.
I'm a professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations, which is a bit weird in some sense, in that my PhD is just in straight up communication. I was working at a University of South Carolina in the journalism department, um, but I was teaching persuasion. I was teaching research methods. 2012, I got offered this job as a public relations professor, and I didn't really think of myself as public relations. I was studying, like you said, public opinion about science, but specifically, I was studying people's perceptions of scientists, which gets you into the world of trust and fairness. And it turns out that's also what we mean when we mean relationships. Right? And so it became apparent to me that really what I could say that I could honestly say that I study public relations for science, for scientists, how to help scientists build relationships with um, whoever they need to build relationships for. And so most of my job is, I'm a professor. My teaching load is like a 1-1, so I teach one course a semester. Um, Often things like graduate methods, or last semester I taught risk communication, so that was fun. But really, so most of my time is spent doing research. That research has a couple of different sort of sides to it. Up until 2012, it was almost all surveys, experiments with different populations trying to understand how they think about specific scientific issues, whether it's nuclear energy, nanotechnology, genetically modified food, specifically interested in the role that the perceptions of the scientists played. And then in about 2012, I had this opportunity to start studying scientists a little bit and how they think about communication. And the idea was, like, we had communication theory, the researchers in my world, my building, we have thoughts about what makes better or worse communication. And it gets a little frustrating at some time. Like, nobody's using our insights, nobody's using our research. And so we started getting the chance to study how scientists think about communication. That got me in touch with a whole world of wonderful people at scientific societies, groups like Compass and the Alan Alda Center that are training scientists. This whole world of people who are in this space of trying to help scientists communicate more effectively. And so now a lot of my research is about trying to understand, how do scientists think about communication, and with the means of, like, well, how can we get them to think about communication a little bit differently, particularly more strategically, specifically, and more evidence-based and strategic. So how do we bring these ideas from research into making communication more effective?
That's actually like a lot of what I do as well. I mean, what I, as a writer, so I'm a scientist, I was a scientist, then I became a writer. Then I realized I apparently am working in marketing. So then I started thinking, like, why doesn't everyone in science start learning marketing principles? And then it would be amazing because the pandemic kind of showed that scientists are not marketers. Like reading scientists' communications online, there was no strategy. There was no strategy from the NIH. There was some strategy from the NIH, but I thought they would do really cool explainers and like tell people, like inform them, because in marketing the whole thing is like, oh, everything's always getting new and improved, and like um so I thought that maybe we could have something like that for the pandemic, like, oh, we're in a pandemic, but don't worry, like we have vaccine. I mean, hindsight is always 2020, but definitely I noticed there's a lot there, and I didn't realize that until I read your book that there's actually people that study science communication, which was really interesting to me. Um, so you're in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations, and advertising is something that we don't really think of in science. There's a lot of communications that happens in science, and scientists get no formal communications training usually, except to know, like, write a lab report, like write this paper, publish this. So what do you do in terms of how do you work in advertising and public relations? I know you're more on the public relations side, but how do you make marketing and advertising relevant to science communication?
And so it's and the reason I often say I'm more on the public relations side than the advertising side is, and we write about this in the book. There's a part of advertising, right? That's, and really when we talk about advertising, it's applied from the people in my building, like the researchers in my department. We could easily call ourselves media psychologists, or some of them do, or applied social psychologists. It's really the psychology, sociology of influence, persuasion, campaigns. We use lots of different words. It all comes down to what makes it more likely that somebody's going to do a behavior. And so, and often on the advertising side is, this is where you get into books like Nudge, or you get into like behavioral economics even, where it's like, well, how do we, in a very short-term sort of thing, make a behavior a little bit more likely? We maybe feel associate a good feeling with a product, associate a specific attribute with a project. Now, so I try not to think about science too much like that. I think there's a bit of a difference with science, and this is why I'm more interested in the public relations side, which is, yes, we want people to see the benefits of science. We want people to see that science is something that our society can invest in and make sense of. And particularly, we want people to see that scientists are highly skilled experts who care about the communities they live in, have put a lot of work into maintaining the integrity, ideally listen to folks and listen to the society, though, there's things we can do better on that space. And so, but I think of it more in terms of, like, the reason I like the public relations side is I think of that more as like where the fast side of advertising, like we're going to nudge people into doing this thing, or use this sort of cognitive bias or heuristic to make something a little bit more likely. On the public relations side, I like it because it's more about how do I get people to have a genuine sense that this person has these attributes, that this person is caring, that this person is honest, that this person is competent, has expertise. Like, those are things that we're not nudging. Like, yeah, we can sort of do a little cue, like put on a white jacket and sort of cue expertise. But really, in the long term, we're not trying to get somebody to buy a product in the short term, like go to a supermarket, take a product off a shelf. We're trying to, or go to a movie. We're trying to, over time, increase the likelihood that people turn to scientists when they're faced really challenging problems, invest in science when they think about where we want to put societal resources, encourage their kids to consider science careers. Like, there's real behaviors we want to do, and they're not behaviors that we want people to trick people into. We want people to genuinely consider them, engage with the ideas around them, and choose those things. And so a lot of what I think about, and a lot of what the book is about, is we talk about the slow communication, but there's a long-term behavior change, not short-term nudges, but there's long-term, let's communicate in ways that allow people to perceive the world in a certain way, develop beliefs that are associated with those perceptions, and then increase the likelihood that they do the behaviors. Always, like, the ethics bit is really tricky. Like, I don't want anyone to believe something that isn't true. Now, the trick is, like, when we think about beliefs, believe in whatever, that's sometimes we use beliefs, but when we use, like, from a social science perception, we could say perception, or social science space. We could say perception, but really perceptions leading to beliefs. It's things like, I believe nuclear energy has these benefits. I believe that vaccines have these benefits and these risks. It's right. It's like it's trying to get people to form those beliefs, but also beliefs about other things, right? I believe scientists are caring. I believe scientists are honest. Like, those are beliefs too. I believe I have the ability to take this action to protect my family. That's a belief too. I believe that other people believe is also a belief. And that those are the things that, when we look at long-term behavior change theories, it's those things that make behaviors more likely, not whether or not somebody knows that the earth goes around the sun, right? It's not a fact, like, knowing how a vaccine works is not the same thing as, or believing how a vaccine works is not the same thing as believing that a vaccine has these benefits and these risks. So it's really being a little bit more granular, a little bit more thoughtful about, well, what kinds of information do we want people to have, and not just thinking I'm going to explain my science, I'm going to distill my science and that'll do things. That's not, we're really focused away from thinking about science communication as explaining science towards what are the, in the context of science, what are the things that would be useful for people to think about risks and benefits, social norms, self-efficacy, perceptions of scientists.
Using communication to shape perceptions of scientists, I think that there's a lot of reasons to that's a good idea. Have you been able to do that successfully, or do you just study this? Like, do you see this in action anywhere?
So we're working, I mean, so we can do it in experimental contexts. We're working on it in a broader context. A lot of it is like that. This is why pulling in all the literature from the social sciences and trying to figure out how to apply that to this specific case. I mean, this is the same problem that every organization, every company has, right? Like, how do I get people to perceive me in a way that I want to be perceived? And so, yeah, so we know that we can do that over time. This is one of the unsatisfying things about a lot of social science is we can do things very like short-term things, but the things we care about are the long-term things, the long-term impacts. And so those are really hard to capture. We can do things like show that there's a relationship between the more you're exposed to a certain type of thing, the more likely you are to hold a certain belief, but that's correlational. But in the short term, we can do experiments like if you're exposed to this type of message, you're more likely to express this type of perception. But then that's why you use theory. That's why you sort of roll all that stuff together. One of the things that's really important to say is we also argue, and there's a key thing of public relations, is that it's not just about shaping other people's beliefs so that you can shape their behaviors. It's also about, if you're doing science communication really well, this is the idea of two-way dialogue, you're trying to use communication to shape your own behavior. You're trying, and through shaping your own beliefs. So you can imagine a scientist who's like working at a research forest and they're trying to figure out what to study or how to study something, and they know that they've been interacting with a community group and a community group's really worried about a certain problem or a certain issue. Maybe that's a topic that they jump on, that they can so now I've chosen a topic because of there's societal interest. Or maybe there's a person who's really worried about a different method, and so they can choose a different approach, a different approach to how they do a study that doesn't infringe on some group's lands or infringe on some sort of cultural thing that's going to be problematic. They can change up how they do their research to be more respectful, right? Really good communication isn't just about I'm trying to affect other people. It's also about how can I use communication so I make better choices, which is to say, how can I use communication to affect myself? It's one of the big challenges in science communication discussions. When I ask a scientist, what's your goal? They'll say I want to decrease misinformation. I want to increase science literacy. I want to get people to experience awe and wonder. And the strategist has to say, those are nice things. Why do you want people to be more science literate? Why do you want people to feel awe and wonder? What type of misinformation do you want to correct? And what do you think will happen if you correct that misinformation? Once you know what objectives you want to affect, like if I'm just trying to increase people's knowledge of a specific thing, you can design, that's an education program, you can design classes around increasing the likelihood people know a thing. But the real thing of strategy is figuring out, well, what do I want to happen? And what beliefs, feelings, frames make that more likely? And what can I ethically communicate to make those beliefs, feelings, frames more likely? And if I realize so let's say I realize that people don't think that I'm honest. I don't know why people would think that, but let's imagine that I find that out. Like that means I need to do something to make sure that I'm communicating all the hard work we do in our research to protect the integrity of the work. Or somebody feels like I don't listen. Well, that means I need to figure out a way to make sure that I am listening. Two, making sure that I'm communicating. Here's how I've listened in the past. Here's how I'm listening now. Here's how I'm going to listen in the future. I can communicate those things to increase the perceptions of that I'm a person who's open, willing to listen, which should conceptually and the research we have available to us suggests that will make people more likely to see you as trustworthy or make them more willing to consider your perspective.
There's a guy named Robert Cialdini, I don't know how to say his name. He wrote a book called Persuasion, and he came up with 6 principles that he spent some time talking to car dealers and I don't know, he advised 10 Downing Street, he advised the Obama presidential campaign. There's like six principles, and I think one of them is, I think you just mentioned one of them. I forgot what it is, but it's like stuff like social proof, seeing other people doing something, and then like expertise or credentials is one, and that's like, really good for scientists.
Yeah, I mean, his book is probably the most sold book on persuasion. And when he talks about social proof, he's talking about what he actually studies is social norms, is what he calls it when he studies it. Um, yeah, and so, yeah, expertise. And that's a great book. Everyone should, I mean, it's best-selling book on persuasion of all time. The trick is with that book, when I read that book, I think like he's sort of mixing this idea of like these short-term communication-y things, like like he talked like when he talks about social norms, like, oh, this has been bought a whole bunch of times, or classic stuff. Some of his people, and we talk about this in one of the chapters in our book. We talk about a bunch of his research in the social norms chapter. Like you can put in a sign in the hotel room that says, people who stayed in this room reused their towels, right? So it's kind of like, it's sort of a very short-term little messagey thing. You're not trying to generally change norms over the long term. It's this sort of short. And so I do think there's lots of great stuff on persuasion in that. I think it's a little bit different from what a lot of like sort of science and health communication, environmental communication researchers think about when we think about like long-term behavior change through really changing people's beliefs. And so like, where do those norms come from?
Science is very complex and it's hard to get people to understand it. And I think we saw that in the pandemic when people just went anti science. I think because it was just almost easier. And I think because the persuasion on the anti science side was actually better because it's hard to get someone to like understand something. And as scientists, I think that, and you're an expert on this, so maybe you can like say something about this. As scientists, my first reaction and very scientists' first reaction, as we saw everywhere, was like, "Oh no, I'm a scientist. Let me explain this to you." I think scientists, they're often seen as like kind of like outside of society because scientists, I think themselves, kind of like one thing that I always think of with science is so my colleagues would often like complain about politics around the lab meeting table, but they never go actually like do science policy. So, um, do you think that if scientists changed their behaviors and got more engaged in policy, they would change their opinions? Like, do you think that the perception of scientists as like trustworthy and warm and like just like an everyday person?
Sure. So I want to go to two things. So first thing is, I think the fundamental problem scientists make is a little bit where you started, which is the goal of communicating about, in the context of COVID, is not to get people to understand COVID. The goal is to get people to do the behaviors you need them to do. And so if you're focusing all your effort on, here's what a spike protein looks like, or here's what, like, if you're focused on understand COVID, you're getting sidetracked. The focus is if you focus, we need people to wear a mask. We need people to stay home. We need people to, then you need to, those are the behaviors you want. And your communication has to be about getting people to have reasonable, to believe the things you need them to believe about those behaviors, that it's going to be beneficial, that it's going to avoid risks, that is normatively acceptable, that they have the ability to do it, that the people recommending it are caring and competent and honest. Those are the things you need to communicate, not here's how virus transmission happens. That might be useful in some sort of way, but it's not the point. Scientists always get distracted by trying to explain the science rather than achieve their goals, or figuring out what their goals are first, and then trying to achieve those goals. And that's why we need strategists ultimately, is because we need somebody to be saying, like, yes, great, it's a wonderful explanation of how the RNA vaccine works. Does that communicate the thing about the behavior we need people to do right now? But strategic communication, at least from like my understanding of the literature that we have, is about how do I make it more likely that somebody does a behavior, and that's about perceptions or beliefs about the behavior, not about the underlying scientific issue, right? And so there's that part of it. And then the part about like, well, if we go to the trust bit and like, can we get people to trust scientists? So one, we know pretty clearly that there's no group in society that people think has more expertise than scientists. We already kind of won that argument. Everybody wants science on their side. My goal is more about, so you think like, if my goal is to get people to turn to me, that's a behavior. I want people to turn to me for advice. If that's the case, I need people to believe that I'm, according to trust theory, theories of trust, 3 layers of credibility, lots of different words, but all comes back to the same sort of concepts. I need people to believe that I have expertise, that I care about them, that I'm honest, that I'm willing to listen, that I share their values, some version of those concepts. And so the degree, if you go and look at scientists' bios, to what degree do they say those things? To what degree do they talk about why they're doing the research, the work that they do to protect the integrity of their research, the work that they do, hopefully, to listen to stakeholder groups or to people who might need their research? Like, where is that information in our bios, in when we give talks? It's not, we jump right into like, here's what I found. And that doesn't do the thing we need it to do, which is if we want people to trust us, they need to believe that we're trustworthy. They need to believe all those things about caring and competence. And the things I repeat all the time.
You have a journalism background, which is, I'm also a healthcare journalist. When you watch science on the news, it's not about, it's just like, here are some science facts that we learned. And sometimes they're not right, like they're not fully factual. We could blame journalists for like reporting science in this way, but that's kind of how we envision science as a society. The end process of this result of this science was just this fact, but I think it's not really like that. I really would love to see more reporting about science that is more like, this science was done in this way, and like then you can talk about like, is it really true? Like that, you don't have time to get into all that, but like I think that would boost the reputation of scientists, like because if on the news, like you're watching the news and they just say like the scientist did this, um they don't have the expertise often in the news to like fact check it for you. How do you feel about science reporting? Because you are in marketing, advertising, you're kind of in this realm, which scientists never really think about in my experience. They should think about it. And that's kind of why I wanted you to be on our YouTube, because you are an expert in this. So do you have any thoughts on public perceptions of science in the news media?
Truth is, if we go back to the original point of, does it really matter? Like in terms of like folks now, like, oh, okay, somebody has a slightly incorrect piece of fact on television. What is the consequence of that for public perception? Does that change the behaviors we really care about? And so again, we can get overly focused on there was an error versus did it communicate the things that I need it to communicate to get the outcome that I'm hoping that I, in theory, should have at least planned for as a result of working with that journalist, right? And so the focus on that factual stuff, I totally understand it. It's easy to get focused on that. But again, it distracts from if your goal is to, whatever your goal is, increase the likelihood of funding. If your goal is to, so we should always worry about being correct, but we shouldn't make everything about that. And so then the question becomes like, are journalists going to communicate about some of these sort of processy things about like how the science was done, the people behind the science? And the answer is maybe, often not. It's really hard to get scientists or journalists, to cover anything that is done well, right? Like the nature of journalism is that it wants to talk about when things go poorly, when people do wrong things. And so it's hard to get any journalist to say, oh, this person really seems to care about society. That's not how journalism, and so that's really tricky. It's even less likely to happen if we don't share that information. If we're not actively, we decide what we talk to with journalists. We decide what to emphasize when we communicate. That's the thing that we have control over. If we have 300 words, what do we have? 45 minutes. If we have 600 words, if we have 100 words, if we have a 30-second soundbite, we can make choices that communicate the things that we want to focus on. And so it's up to us, to some people in the scientific community, to decide, to think through, like, well, what's the most important thing for us? Is the most important thing to get it exactly right with all the nuance? And I'm going to put all my time on that. And so there's that element. There's another element of it, which is, let's say there are popular science-associated media figures who like to do things like go on and talk about how dumb everyone is, right? So if the image of science on television is a scientist talking about how stupid everybody else is, does that make it more likely that people are going to see scientists as caring and honest and willing to listen, or does it make them look like jerks? If you go on to the internet and tell everybody they're wrong and so stupid, and you don't have a right to an opinion because of what. Again, does that make scientists look better or worse? I'm going to argue worse. And so there's all these choices that we can make in how we communicate that they can make scientists look bad, make scientists look good. And, there's something to be said for being the best version of ourselves, at least trying to. Our goal is to share specific things through media coverage, that we think about media as being an opportunity to interact with the people on the other side of journalists. Our goal, again, this is where our goal is to get media coverage. Your goal is not to get media coverage. Your goal is to share some thoughts, share some insights, share something with a community that reads the journalist's work.
You have policy background, you're a journalist, you study communication, all of the stuff we never talk about in science.
The policy thing background's really useful. But I think with good policy people, it's all strategy, right? Like strategy is for policy, strategy is for communication, strategy is for business. We use the language of strategy, even though we could just talk about intentional communication. But it turns out if you really want to get into the world of strategy, it's worth thinking about strategy broadly. In communication, I think the difference is we have to think about outcomes as behaviors, like goals as behaviors, objectives as being what people believe or feel, how they frame things, which are sort of more cognitive stuff in people's heads. And then the tactics are like, what do we say? What do we do? How do we say it? Who says it? Where do we say it? When do we say it? Those sort of tactical level choices. In terms of training, what do I think about training? I've sort of shifted my views on this a little bit. I got into this thinking, we need to train scientists to communicate better. And we've done a couple of different studies where we've interviewed lots of the training groups around the country. We've done a little bit of training, supported training, advised trainers. And I still really think that scientists, really anybody, any executive-y type person, which scientists at the end of the day are executives of their own research, needs to have some ability to communicate, do good presentations, write well, all those good things. But that can't be the only skill, right? Like, so you can be a really skilled communicator communicating the exact wrong thing. And so that's where the strategy thing gets in. And this is where at what point is it just, it's a lot already being a scientist. Like there's so many things. I wish I could be a better social scientist. I wish I knew better stats a little better. I wish I knew more theories. I wish I knew more. It's really hard doing everything. And so increasingly, one of our grants, one of our research programs right now, actually a couple of them, are built around if I'm in a company, let's say I'm a CEO of a company, or I'm a chief operating officer of a company, somebody up in the C-suite. I'm not responsible for all aspects of communication. I have experts. Presumably there's a chief communication officer, but they have a whole team. They have a team of strategists, maybe. They have tacticians, somebody who's really good at video, really good at writing, really good. There's a structure in place that helps you communicate well. And so we think a politician, right? At a certain level, politicians write their own speeches and set up the coffee house where they'll give a talk. But at some point, they graduate to that next level where they have schedulers and writers and people and strategists and people to help them. And so there is this sort of interesting question about how do we get to a level where scientists have access to someone to help them with strategy, as well as someone to help them with some of the more tactical stuff. And so that, yes, we're going to do some of our own stuff, or some DIY communication stuff, but it can't all be DIY communication. We need at least some infrastructure for the scientific community through scientific societies, through centers and like research centers and labs. We need people both thinking strategically as well as helping out at advising at the tactical level, supporting at the tactical level. For the most part now, scientists just have to do everything themselves. And I just can't see how that's anything sustainable in the long term. It's certainly, the consequences are we sort of muddle our way through it and are susceptible to other groups who are more strategic.
Basically, in today's world, and I think it's probably always been this way, whoever communicates the best, regardless of whether their communications are totally factual, wins out. The one thing that I was really excited about was the March on Science that we did it here in the US. I don't know if Canada did this, because Canada's always seemed more pro-science than that. They did have that also. I thought that was amazing for scientists to get involved in the policy process. There's a lot of politicization of science.
March for Science, I worry that what was the goal of that? What were we trying to accomplish? Who are we? What was our purpose And again, that sort of just happened, right? Wasn't the thing that really bugged me about that is we were clearly in a point where the scientific community wanted to say something, wanted to do something, but the scientific societies weren't the ones that were leading. Scientific leader, it ended up being a bunch of grad students, postdocs, right, that took this because there was a vacuum to fill, because there was nobody in a leadership positions, universities, whatever. They were hesitating, understandably hesitating, because it was a really tricky thing to figure out how do we talk about these things in a way that doesn't further politicize things. The mistake is thinking that my goal is to get people to worry about climate change. Well, why do you want people to worry about climate change? What behaviors do you want them to do? Do you want them to install more solar panels? Then let's communicate the benefits of solar panels and the cost of solar panels. And do you want people to do more wind power? Let's talk about wind power. We don't have to talk about climate change, understand how climate change works, and then you're automatically going to buy an electric vehicle. That's not, behavior is buy the electric vehicle. So you need to believe that buying an electric vehicle, and so one of the benefits might be an environmental benefits, but I just bought a plug-in hybrid. It's great. I mean, I love not having to fill up gas. I mean, it's a nice little car. And so there's other benefits, other things that you can communicate beyond pollution benefits. There's like local air quality benefits, cost benefits. There's other things we can communicate beyond just environmental benefits of a behavior. And so it's really thinking about, and I think this is what people are finding in the climate. There's a lot more opportunity. My congressperson is Alyssa Slotkin. She gave a talk here recently. She really talked about, like, this is a very swing district. She doesn't focus on climate change. She focuses on, well, what can we do to make this community more energy independent? What can we do to give farmers this added source of income when they install windmills on their properties? Or all these other benefits that get the behavior we want without getting focused on, do people understand how global warming works? But we do, it's often the thing that we can control is, do we as the scientific community contribute to politicization? And the answer is often yes. And so how do we make that less likely?
It's not productive when you have science and you have politicization, because science itself is like hugely bipartisan, because facts aren't Democrat or Republican. They're just scientific truths. And I think that's something we want to believe as scientists. And I think that I think we all believe that, like, the science in the US Congress, science has bipartisan support. Conservatives, liberals, middle of the road people. So I think that,
there's
like,
specific issues where there's disagreements, but yeah, for them general, they've continued to fund science through a lot of things. I mean, it's not. We always wish we were more, but yeah, it could be worse.
And I went to Capitol Hill to speak to my members of Congress, and it was like I went to a Tea Party person. I'm a Democrat. I actually also do political communications in addition to science communication. So, but I went there and I just like hung out with them, and I had a good conversation, because you can totally, if you're goal oriented, like you said, which I really thought that was really interesting. Your strategic mind, like, if you're goal oriented, you can basically achieve your goals not by just like focusing on your goal without politicizing things, because science is science. I don't think science should be politicized. I don't think it needs to be politicized to advance in the world, because it's bipartisan. I think like those principles apply probably not just to the US and Canada, but to other governments. The strategy piece, I think, is key for scientists. As you said, in academic science, if they have like a certain goal, to strategically write and communicate to achieve that goal, rather than just, as scientists, we have this natural urge to explain stuff day and night and be like, oh, do you understand this? But maybe that's not as productive or useful as I thought. And that's like the whole area of science communication, is kind of to get people to appreciate science. But it kind of, after this conversation, I feel like I have to shift all of my communications that I was doing to be more strategic. And I'd rather be strategic than just do everything in the world. So strategy really helps you like achieve your goals. And I think we as scientists need to revisit that. So thank you for your time today. I don't know if you have any thoughts, or if you want to like preview anything you're working on without, I don't know. Are you working on anything like really exciting, like another book maybe?
Right now, we're really focused on that infrastructure bit. Like, how do we create a system where scientists aren't just on their own to figure out communication? That they have this role of the strategist. So we talked about strategy and evidence-based strategy, and again, that part of just being always that, like, well, but why am I doing this? Why why am I every time I'm making a choice that I'm intentional about the choice, like why are we trying to do this, and not being satisfied. Well, correct misinformation. That's not a well, why do you like always pushing that why thing is the core of strategy. But yeah, but because we're sort of increasingly thinking like doing strategy is hard, and it's actually kind of people don't love it. I gotta tell you, like people don't love it when you put people just want to often in science comm and all kinds of places just want to do the thing that they enjoy doing, and being that person who's like, yeah, but why are we doing that? Like, why are we putting money into this? What are we hoping to get out of this? Isn't always the best received, but I think it's vital, and I'm trying to figure out how to do it in a way. We're looking for opportunities to test these ideas and use these ideas. We've had great partners, Kavli Foundation, National Science Foundation, who's been supporting us, trying to find opportunities to think about how do we take these ideas of strategy and get them into the scientific community. And so, yeah, and so hopefully someday there'll be a book that's about stories about science. Oh, and we're always looking for stories of success of people who have done strategy in the context of science. It's a little harder to find than I would have liked, but we're always looking for those stories if people have them. And so the next book, if there's a book, I hope will be a story about successful examples of strategic thinking in the science space. That's my hope.
This has been an amazing conversation. I've learned so much. I hope that our viewers will learn a lot because I feel like this is the kind of conversation I wish we have been having in SciComm, and I finally had it. So thank you so much for this opportunity to chat with you.
Thank you.